You can almost hear the clink of chains beneath the music of a royal court. The scent of sandalwood hides the stench of sweat and iron. You stand in the great audience hall of Delhi, watching as a man once sold in a marketplace kneels before the most powerful sultan in India, and realizes in that instant that he has never been freer. Before we begin, take a moment to marvel at how far these stories travel. From Delhi to Detroit, from Lahore to London, you, yes, you, are part of this strange fellowship of history lovers who breathe life into forgotten empires. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and join the circle of those who know that history, like ambition, is never truly dead. They said his price was 1,000 dinars. In Gujarat, that sum could buy a dozen horses or a merchant's freedom. But the soldier who sold the boy to Sultan Alive did not bargain for livestock. He offered beauty, a youth of such uncanny grace that the court poets later claimed his skin reflected moonlight. The Sultan called him Hazar Dinar, the 1,000-dinar man, and within months the boy's name spread like wildfire through the corridors of Delhi, Malik Kafur. He arrived at court in chains, a Hindu captive from the plundered city of Kambhat. But what set him apart was not submission. It was the gleam in his eyes when he looked upon power. While other slaves trembled, Kafur studied. While nobles mocked his accent, he memorized their alliances. He became indispensable to Alauddin not through flattery, but through precision. When the Sultan asked a question, Kafur's answers were exacting, surgical. "This one," Alauddin told his generals, "thinks like a blade." Delhi in 1302 was not a city of peace. The Mongols thundered at the empire's frontiers, leaving smoking ruins in their wake. To rule meant to suspect everyone. Alauddin Khalji had risen by murdering his uncle, Jalaluddin, in a garden banquet, a lesson in treachery he never forgot. He surrounded himself with spies and assassins. Trust was a currency rarer than gold, and in that climate of paranoia, Malik Kafur flourished. He began as a chamber slave, then a bodyguard. Soon he was commanding cavalry raids deep into the Deccan, the first general from bondage to ride beneath the Sultan's banner. His campaigns were brutal and brilliant. He marched across India like a living storm, burning temples, seizing gold, breaking dynasties. When he captured Warangal, chroniclers wrote that the plunder blinded the sun with its brightness. Alauddin rewarded him with a jewel-encrusted sword and the title Naib, deputy of the empire. To the courtiers it was blasphemy. A slave seated among princes. Whispers filled the marble halls that the Sultan was bewitched, that Kafur's beauty hid witchcraft, that his devotion masked poison. Yet none dared to speak aloud what they all feared, that the Sultan trusted no one else. For Alauddin, Kafur was the perfect weapon, familyless, rootless, without any claim to power beyond his master's favor. At night, the palace lamps burned low, their smoke curling like ghosts against the carved ceilings. The Sultan and his general would plan campaigns over maps drawn on silk. The old chronicler Barani claimed that Alauddin once said, "The world bows before two kinds of men, those born to rule and those who take it by force." Kafur listened, silent, memorizing every word. In 1308, he led the infamous Southern Expedition, a conquest that would make him legend. From Devagiri to Madurai, the armies of Delhi carved a trail of devastation that stretched over 1,000 miles. The elephants carried back so much loot that treasuries overflowed. The famed Koh-i-Noor diamond is said to have entered the Sultanate through Kafur's hands, but what returned with him was more dangerous than any gem: ambition. In the chronicles of the court, there is a strange detail. When Kafur presented the spoils of war, Alauddin placed his hand on the general's head, a gesture reserved for sons. From that day, the courtiers began to murmur that the Sultan's heir was no longer of his blood, and though Kafur bowed low, his smile never reached his eyes. Power, once tasted, changes the tongue. The slave who had once obeyed began to issue orders of his own. He replaced commanders with his loyal men, reshaped the army's pay, tightened his grip on information. The Sultan, aging and ill, began to rely on him for everything. The guards at the palace gates answered not to the throne, but to Kafur. When Alauddin demanded reports of rebellion, it was Kafur's words that became truth. And yet, for all his mastery, the shadow of servitude still haunted him. Every time a noble bowed, he could feel the faint edge of contempt beneath the courtesy. Every victory he won was still prefaced with a single reminder: slave. To erase that word would take more than loyalty. It would take fire. One night, according to later Persian accounts, Kafur stood on the palace terrace, staring over the sleeping city. The torches below flickered like dying stars. Behind him, the Sultan's coughing echoed through the corridors, a reminder that his master was mortal. When a servant asked if he would rest, Kafur replied softly, "A man rests when there is no one left to obey." It was not a threat. It was a prophecy. By 1313, he had become the empire's most powerful general, and its most feared whisper. The Mongols were defeated, the Deccan conquered, and the Delhi Sultanate stretched from the Himalayas to the sea. But within the jeweled palaces, something began to rot. The Sultan's health waned, his paranoia deepened. He saw enemies in every shadow, poison in every cup, and through it all Malik Kafur stood by his side, calm and watchful, like a priest attending the slow death of a god. In the winter of that year, as the Sultan's fever worsened, he asked his physicians if he would live to see another campaign. They said no. He turned to Kafur and whispered, "Then the empire is yours to guard." The words were meant as trust, but to Kafur they sounded like permission. And so began the long night of Delhi, when a slave waited beside his master's bed, listening to each fading breath, and wondered whether mercy was just another word for weakness. When dawn came, the Sultan still lived. But the man who had served him faithfully for years was already planning a world without him. The 1,000-dinar slave had become something else entirely, a man whose price could no longer be measured. The marble corridors of Siri Fort no longer echoed with the clang of armor. Instead, they whispered. Beneath the painted ceilings, servants bowed with their eyes lowered, unsure who among them carried the Sultan's seal, and who carried Malik Kafur's word. The air itself seemed heavy, like breath trapped between two lies. In the final years of Alauddin Khalji's reign, Delhi became a city without sleep. Spies moved like shadows through the alleys, their footsteps soft but their ears sharp. Even the call to prayer sounded subdued, as though the muezzins feared their own voices might be reported. The Sultan, once a conqueror who had broken kings and Mongols alike, now sat in his chamber surrounded by medicine jars and suspicion. He no longer rode to battle. He counted enemies in his dreams. And beside his bed, ever patient, stood Malik Kafur. He had learned long ago that power was not taken by storm, but by silence. While others plotted in candlelight, Kafur rewrote the language of command. Every decree passed through his hands. Every messenger answered to his chain of approval. If the Sultan spoke, Kafur's scribes transcribed. If the Sultan fell silent, Kafur's words filled the void. The courtiers called him the Sultan's right hand. What they did not say, though all of them knew, was that the left hand had already withered. It began with the heirs. Alauddin's sons were young, proud, and dangerously aware of their bloodline. The eldest, Khizr Khan, had once been adored by the city, a prince of noble face and poetic tongue. But poetry could not survive in a palace ruled by dread. One evening, as chroniclers later whispered, a letter arrived at the Sultan's bedside. It spoke of treachery, of secret meetings, of rebellion. It bore the signature of a loyal informer, Malik Kafur's seal at the bottom. Alauddin's hands trembled as he read. "My own son," he murmured. Kafur, standing behind him, lowered his gaze. "Majesty," he said softly, "a candle that burns too bright draws moths. Let me guard your light." By dawn, Khizr Khan was in chains. His younger brother was blinded. The rest were scattered, to fortresses, to oblivion. The Sultan signed each order with shaking fingers, but the pen was guided by Kafur's hand. The palace changed after that. Curtains were drawn tighter, laughter grew scarce. Eunuchs replaced ministers. In the courtyards, fountains ran with petals instead of water, a ritual of silence that the superstitious said pleased the spirits. And above it all, Malik Kafur moved unseen, a man of perfume and poison, command and devotion. Chroniclers from the period wrote in tones of dread. The Sultan sees through another's eyes, one noted, and hears through another's tongue. But even that was a simplification. Kafur was not a puppeteer yanking strings. He was the tension in the strings themselves. By the winter of 1315, Alauddin's fever worsened. Physicians came and went, whispering about divine punishment or palace air turned venomous. On the 25th night of the cold season, the Sultan, drenched in sweat, called for his general. The torches flickered as Kafur knelt beside him. "Do not let my sons divide what I built," Alauddin rasped. "Guard it, as you have guarded me." "I shall guard it with my life," Kafur replied, and meant it in a way the dying man could not have imagined. When dawn came, the Sultan no longer breathed. The cry went out across Delhi, a cry swiftly muffled. Kafur ordered the gates of the palace closed, the death kept secret until the succession was sealed. For 35 days he ruled in the Sultan's name, forging decrees and summoning armies, while the empire's true ruler lay wrapped in silk and decay. Messengers rode through the fog to announce a new heir, not the blinded prince but a child placed on the throne with Kafur as regent. The slave had become the empire's voice, its memory, its executioner. In the courtyards, soldiers whispered of ghosts haunting the fort, of Alauddin's spirit unable to rest. In the markets, poets sang verses too carefully phrased to offend. No one dared to ask where the princes had gone, or why the mosques prayed for both sultan and deputy in the same breath. For 35 days, Delhi was a stage play. Every actor terrified, every line written by one man. And yet, beneath the marble calm, the city seethed. The nobles who had bowed too long began to whisper again, this time not of loyalty, but of vengeance. The first blade that turned against Malik Kafur was not drawn in daylight. It slid silently through a curtain one night, its owner's face hidden behind the veil of duty. But even as the guards dragged him down, Kafur did not beg. He is said to have looked his killers in the eye and smiled. "So," he murmured, "the puppets have learned to dance without their strings." When dawn came, his body hung between two worlds, slave and ruler, servant and tyrant, a figure carved from ambition itself. And in the silent court of Delhi, the wind carried a single question through the empty halls. Had the empire lost its master, or had it merely lost its mirror? The crown was light, yet it crushed him. It gleamed with the tears of dead kings, with the sweat of soldiers who never lived to see its radiance. Malik Kafur sat beneath its weight, feeling not triumph, but a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the air itself. Delhi, in the winter of 1316, was a city of ghosts. The Sultan was dead, and his name, Alauddin Khalji, was whispered only at night. The empire had no ruler, no certainty, no mercy. And in that void, the 1,000-dinar slave seized the throne. He called it guardianship. The courtiers called it heresy. The marble courtyards, once alive with the shuffle of diplomats and poets, now smelled of oil and iron. Torches burned low. The banners of war hung limp against the palace walls. Those who had mocked him as a eunuch turned general now bowed before him. faces pale with the knowledge that the Sultan's wrath had found a new vessel. Kafur wasted no time. Within hours of Alauddin's death, he summoned the royal scribes. The new decree was short, ruthless. The princes are enemies of the crown. One by one, the heirs of Khalji's blood were brought before him, some pleading, some cursing, some still too young to speak. In the darkness of the court, lit only by the gold of the throne, Malik Kafur's voice was calm. "Loyalty," he said, "is not born, it is chosen." The blades answered in place of prayers. The oldest prince was strangled with silken cords, a courtesy reserved for nobility. The younger was blinded, his cries echoing against the marble until the guards could no longer meet each other's eyes. Outside, the city remained quiet. The people had learned that in Delhi, noise was dangerous. For 35 days, Malik Kafur ruled as both regent and warden. He replaced ministers with eunuchs, soldiers with spies. Every letter from the provinces was intercepted, every messenger questioned. He ordered food tasters for each meal, guards for each door, locks upon locks for his chambers. Fear had made him emperor, and fear was now his empire. Yet even monsters hear their own footsteps in the dark. The first signs came from the barracks. Officers who had once sworn to him began to vanish. A rumor spread that the late Sultan's widow, Malika Jat, was plotting revenge, that she had promised gold and forgiveness to the guard who struck first. Another whisper claimed the blinded prince still breathed and that the people prayed for his return. Kafur grew restless. He began sleeping in different rooms each night. He trusted no servant, no meal, no sound. He ordered the palace well drained and refilled in case of poison. The mirrors in his chamber were covered. He could not stand to see the reflection of a man who had become everything he once despised. One night, as thunder rolled above Delhi, Kafur called his steward. "How long," he asked, "before even my shadow betrays me?" The steward, trembling, said nothing. Kafur smiled, a small, terrible smile. "Then I must strike before it does." That same night, soldiers loyal to him stormed the women's quarters. Those who had nursed the princes, who had whispered the Sultan's name, were dragged away. The river ran thick with silence, the kind that only follows screams. But the tide of fear had already turned. The captains of the royal guard, sickened and afraid, gathered in secret beneath the fortress walls. "He was born a slave," one said, "and he will die as one. Delhi must be freed." On the 35th day of his rule, before dawn, the rebellion struck. The palace doors were forced open, the torches guttered as steel clashed in the corridors. Malik Kafur, awakened by the sound, seized his sword and fled toward the inner court. "Who dares?" he shouted, voice echoing off the marble. "By whose order?" A voice answered from the shadows. "By the Sultan's sons, and by God's justice." What happened next was not recorded, only imagined. Some said he fought like a demon until the end. Others swore he begged for life. But one Persian chronicler, writing years later, described the scene in chilling detail. He died not by the sword, but by the same cords he had used upon princes. When morning came, his body was displayed at the palace gate. Once radiant, now gray as ash. The crown lay beside him, cracked where it had struck the floor. Delhi exhaled for the first time in weeks. The courtiers who had feared his smile now stepped forward to condemn his name. And yet, even in death, Malik Kafur refused to disappear. Stories began to spread, of ghosts walking the fortress of Gwalior, of a eunuch's shadow haunting the Sultan's tomb, of a slave who rose so high that even heaven envied him. Whether he was tyrant or victim, prophet or fiend, no one could say. History could not decide, only echo. And in that echo the warning endured. The empire that feeds on cruelty must one day taste its own blood.